Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is a question posed quietly, often without expecting an answer, that lingers at the edge of Lovecraftian scholarship. Why does Cthulhu never truly wake? The image of the dreaming god, submerged in the cyclopean geometry of Rolia, has haunted literature, art, and philosophy for nearly a century. Yet despite the myth's cultural saturation, its central premise remains unresolved. The idea that Cthulhu slumbers, that his awakening is always imminent but never realized, is more than narrative delay. It is a symbol, a metaphor, a philosophical warning embedded deep within a literary tradition that resists finality. To understand this motif, we must begin with its origins, historical, psychological, linguistic. We must trace how H.P. Lovecraft, shaped by the anxieties of early 20th century America, constructed a mythology not of gods and heroes, but of dreams, distances, and cosmic silence. From these beginnings, we will move slowly through thematic implications, literary manifestations, and cultural aftershocks. Along the way, we will consider madness not as breakdown, but as revelation. We will examine the sea not as a setting, but as a boundary between knowing and unknowing. This is not simply an inquiry into fiction, but into a kind of truth that fiction is uniquely equipped to preserve. By asking why Cthulhu never wakes, we are not looking for answers. We are learning how to dwell with the unanswerable, and in doing so, we may already be closer to the myth than we realize. It is impossible to approach the myth of Cthulhu without first situating its creator, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, within the peculiar tension of his age. Born in 1890, Lovecraft lived through an era when the human species was beginning to lose faith in its own centrality. The post-World War I world was marked by disillusionment, scientific upheaval, and the decay of traditional metaphysical assurances. In this environment, Lovecraft's imagination found its structure, a cosmos vast, indifferent, and terrifyingly impersonal. His great old ones are not deities in any moral sense, but rather artifacts of scale, so vast that they annihilate the very notion of comprehension. Consider carefully how this context shapes the central question: why does Cthulhu never wake? It is not simply narrative suspense, but a reflection of modernity's spiritual exhaustion, the paralysis of an age that has glimpsed its insignificance. His slumber becomes the perfect image of cosmic stasis, an epoch that dreams but never acts, that senses dread but cannot articulate it. By the 1920s, Lovecraft had evolved from an imitator of Gothic horror to the architect of a new mythology, one grounded in science rather than superstition, in entropy rather than evil. His correspondences reveal a man simultaneously enthralled by astronomy and terrified by its implications. The discoveries of the expanding universe and geological deep time rendered humanity temporally microscopic. To Lovecraft, this was not revelation, but existential vertigo. When he wrote The Call of Cthulhu in 1926, he was translating this vertigo into narrative form. The creature's sleep beneath the ocean is an allegory for humanity's latent awareness of its own futility, a dream consciousness that must remain dormant lest it destroy sanity. We must recognize here that Lovecraft's God does not wait to rise. Rather, he represents the permanent latency of meaning itself. Lovecraft's social anxieties were inseparable from his cosmic ones. The 1910s and 1920s brought economic instability, urban migration, and a shifting social order that he viewed with unease. In his letters, he describes modern civilization as decadent and unreal, terms that echo his fiction's obsession with decay and illusion. The Call of Cthulhu was written amidst this sense of collapse, of old hierarchies dissolving under the pressure of modern chaos. In this light, Cthulhu's sleep becomes not merely cosmic, but cultural. It mirrors a civilization that feels its foundations shifting beneath it, yet remains unable to awaken into full awareness. The sleeping god is civilization's own unconscious, vast and alien, stirring only in dreams and art. Not a monster beneath the sea, but a symbol beneath history. The construction of Rulia itself, the sunken city of impossible angles, embodies this fusion of cosmic dread and cultural alienation. Its description as non-Euclidean architecture is not arbitrary. It evokes the early 20th century's encounter with non-Euclidean geometry and Einstein's relativity, both of which undermined centuries of human certainty about space and time. Lovecraft, ever the amateur scientist, recognized the philosophical implications. Reality itself was mutable, indifferent to human categories. Thus, when Cthulhu lies dreaming in that city, his repose mirrors the universe's own slumber, an ordered chaos, simultaneously asleep and awake. We might say that Arlia dreams Cthulhu as much as Cthulhu dreams Arlia. This recursive logic, so typical of Lovecraft, transforms myth into metaphysics. The sleep is not merely biological, it is ontological. Another layer emerges when we consider Lovecraft's use of dreams as a literary device. He often claimed his stories came from his own nightmares, and in his letters to fellow writers such as Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, he describes these visions as both creative and parasitic. Dreams for Lovecraft were portals, not to psychological truth, but to an older, alien consciousness. When he wrote that Cthulhu dreams beneath the waves, he inverted the common mystical trope. The divine no longer awakens humanity, but infects it with its own somnolence. It is not enlightenment, but contamination. The artist, the dreamer, and the madman become unwilling mediums through whom fragments of this sleeping mind leak into human awareness. Here, sleep functions not as rest, but as diffusion, a slow psychic radiation emanating from the abyss. Consider carefully what this inversion implies. In traditional theology, the god sleeps until his followers awaken him. In Lovecraft's mythos, it is the opposite. Human minds awaken to their insignificance when they sense that he still dreams. Cthulhu's dormancy sustains reality itself, for awakening would collapse the fragile illusion of separateness between mind and cosmos. His slumber is the boundary that keeps thought from dissolving into chaos. Thus, to wake Cthulhu would not mean the return of a creature, but the end of all epistemic distinction. It is not an event, but an erasure. We must pause here, for this reveals something profound, that the myth's terror lies not in the sleeping god's return, but in the recognition that his sleep may already define the structure of reality. The waking world is but the residue of his dream. From a literary standpoint, Lovecraft's intent was both documentary and philosophical. He wanted his tales to read as found truths, accounts gathered by scholars who stumbled upon evidence too vast for comprehension. In The Call of Cthulhu, the story unfolds through diaries, police reports, and sailor testimonies, each adding another layer of credibility to the impossible. This technique transforms horror into scholarship. The reader becomes an archivist, rather than a spectator. By embedding the myth in the language of research, Lovecraft ensures its ambiguity. The text's structure mirrors its subject, fragmented, recursive, forever circling the unspeakable center. The monster never fully emerges because the story's form itself prohibits awakening. In this sense, Cthulhu's perpetual sleep is also narrative necessity. Horror requires containment, not closure. By the time of his death in 1937, Lovecraft had built a self-sustaining mythology, a system that grows precisely because it never resolves. His god remains asleep because the myth's power depends on deferral. Each new generation rediscovers the fragments, adding layers, misinterpreting, believing. This endless reinterpretation as its form of immortality. To awaken Cthulhu would be to end the story, to abolish mystery, to extinguish fear through revelation. Instead, Lovecraft ensures the opposite, that the myth continually approaches but never reaches its center. In doing so, he transforms cosmic horror into a living system of cultural recursion. Every mythology arises from the residue of older stories, and Lovecraft's Cthulhu is no exception. The notion of a slumbering deity, vast beyond reckoning, can be traced across continents and centuries, revealing that the idea of divine dormancy predates Lovecraft by millennia. In Sumerian myth, the primordial goddess Tiamat lies dormant in the waters of chaos until disturbed by the gods of order, a pattern echoed in Egyptian cosmology where Osiris sleeps in the underworld, sustaining the cycle of life and death. Similarly, in Hindu cosmology, Vishnu dreams the universe itself, and when he stirs, creation unfolds anew. Lovecraft's Cthulhu inherits this ancient lineage, but strips it of transcendence. Where earlier gods slept to renew life, Lovecraft's god sleeps, because life, and perhaps consciousness itself, is a byproduct of his dreaming. Consider this carefully. The ancient pattern of death and rebirth becomes, in Lovecraft's vision, an endless, half-conscious paralysis. The sacred cycle of awakening turns nihilistic, trapped between creation and annihilation. By the late 19th century, these religious motifs intersected with the emerging language of modern philosophy. Schopenhauer's concept of the blind will suggested a universe that moves without purpose, a force that drives all existence but offers no moral or teleological direction. Lovecraft, whose private letters reveal a deep engagement with this pessimistic worldview, absorbed such notions into his fiction. In this context, Cthulhu's sleep mirrors the blind will itself, ceaseless yet unconscious, creative yet indifferent. This was no mere metaphor. It was a metaphysical statement disguised as horror. The dream of the god is the mechanism of reality. To wake him would be to awaken the will, to force meaning upon a cosmos that cannot sustain it. Thus, his eternal slumber is mercy, entropy, and balance combined. It is not the absence of divinity, but its most honest form. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead resounded through the intellectual corridors of the early 20th century, but Lovecraft's response was uniquely literal. He did not imagine a world without gods. He imagined gods that continued to exist long after their relevance had ended. Nietzsche's dead god was a metaphor for moral decay. Lovecraft's sleeping gods were cosmic leftovers, immense and purposeless, beyond even morality's corpse. The difference is telling. Nietzsche's abyss gazes back. Lovecraft's abyss dreams. We must recognize that this inversion transforms existential philosophy into mythic fatalism. Humanity becomes not the killer of its gods, but the dream image that persists in their unconscious. The idea of awakening, once associated with enlightenment, becomes catastrophic. The philosopher's realization and the priest's revelation converge into the same horror, that consciousness is an accident within a sleeping cosmos. Equally influential were the scientific revolutions that destabilized the 19th century worldview. Darwin's theory of evolution shattered the illusion of human uniqueness. Einstein's relativity dissolved the stability of time and space. Freud's psychoanalysis uncovered the unconscious as the true seat of human motivation. Each of these discoveries eroded the notion of a coherent self. Lovecraft absorbed these developments as philosophical ammunition. In Cthulhu, we find the culmination of all three: an organism beyond species, existing in dimensions beyond time, whose dreaming infects the minds of men. The sleeping god is a fusion of cosmic science and psychological dread. It represents the human mind's discovery that the universe functions without witness, that order and meaning are temporary hallucinations, not simply a monster beneath the sea, but a mirror held to the modern intellect, brilliant, rational, and fundamentally unmoored. We can also trace Lovecraft's use of forbidden knowledge to earlier occult and esoteric traditions. In Hermetic and theosophical writings of the late 19th century, Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, Eliphas Levy's Dogme et Rituel de la Haute Magie, 1856, we encounter the recurring theme of lost civilizations and sleeping powers beneath the earth. These movements promised illumination through esoteric study, yet Lovecraft inverted their optimism. His forbidden knowledge offers not ascent, but collapse. The Necronomicon, supposedly penned by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, functions as a parody of such occult texts. It promises wisdom, but delivers dissolution. Here, Lovecraft both continues and critiques Western esotericism. Knowledge becomes infection, and revelation becomes descent. The seeker, like the cultist of Cthulhu, does not awaken to truth, but sinks deeper into the dream. The metaphysical weight of Cthulhu's slumber also bears striking resemblance to Eastern philosophies that emphasize illusion and impermanence. In certain strands of Buddhist thought, reality is described as a dream state of samsara, an endless cycle of awakening and forgetting. Yet Lovecraft's cosmos lacks compassion or enlightenment. His dream state has no bodhisattva to guide it. The cycle becomes static, an eternal night without dawn. Where the Buddha wakes to end suffering, Cthulhu dreams to preserve it, not liberation, but preservation of futility. In this, we see Lovecraft's philosophical divergence. He appropriates the language of mysticism, but empties it of spiritual promise. The result is what scholars have called negative transcendence, a spiritual experience without salvation. His mythology does not deny the sacred, it renders it incomprehensible. At the same time, Lovecraft's fascination with the sleeping world reflects the modernist preoccupation with perception and reality. Writers like Henry James, T.S. Eliot, and Virginia Woolf explored consciousness as a shifting landscape of dreams and fragments. Lovecraft radicalized this introspection. In his universe, consciousness is not fragile merely in psychological terms. It is metaphysically misplaced. The human mind dreams of stability because the universe does not possess it. Consider how this reflects early 20th century anxieties. After the devastation of World War I, reality itself seemed fractured, unreliable, suspended between nightmare and waking. Lovecraft translates this collective trauma into cosmic metaphor. The The question why Cthulhu never wakes becomes indistinguishable from why history never ends. Both suggest that humanity is trapped within cycles of partial awareness, oscillating between dread and denial. Philosophically, Cthulhu's slumber can also be read as an allegory of epistemic humility. Lovecraft's letters frequently express contempt for metaphysical speculation, emphasizing instead the vastness of the unknown. His fictional gods embody the ultimate unknowability of being, and their sleep becomes a dramatization of that limit. The universe sleeps because knowledge itself sleeps. We exist within its dream, never outside it. To awaken Cthulhu would be to transcend knowledge, an act both impossible and self-negating. Here, Lovecraft approaches something akin to Kant's notion of the noumenon, the thing in itself, forever inaccessible. But where Kant left a space for rational faith, Lovecraft leaves only terror. The noumenon is not sublime. It is sleeping, and its dreams are our reality. In synthesizing these influences, ancient myth, modern science, Western pessimism, and Eastern metaphysics, Lovecraft created a uniquely modern cosmology. Cthulhu's unending sleep encapsulates the trajectory of Western thought itself, from divine order to mechanistic chaos, from revelation to uncertainty, from meaning to indifference. The sleeping god becomes an emblem of the human condition after modernity. We know too much to believe, yet too little to awaken. This paradox is not merely thematic, it is structural to Lovecraft's mythos. His stories always end where they begin, within ignorance renewed. The dream continues because consciousness cannot bear its termination. Language in Lovecraft's mythos does more than describe. It destabilizes. Unlike the ornate prose of his Gothic predecessors, Lovecraft's most potent horror arises not from adjectives, but from what language cannot contain. Nowhere is this clearer than in the etymology of Cthulhu, a name so alien it resists pronunciation. Lovecraft himself admitted the name was untranslatable in human phonetics, suggesting in his letters that it sounded something like Cthulhu. Yet even this approximation disorients. It is not simply an alien word, but a fracture in the symbolic order, a signifier detached from any familiar referent. This linguistic dislocation mirrors the myth's core anxiety, that the universe is not only uncaring, but fundamentally unreadable. Cthulhu's name is not a password, but a rupture, and it introduces a broader pattern across Lovecraft's work, in which the act of naming becomes a portal to madness rather than mastery. We must pause here and consider what this reveals. Traditionally, to name a thing is to know it, to exercise dominion over it, a principle embedded in magical, religious, and philosophical traditions. In Genesis, Adam names the creatures of the earth as a form of divine delegation. In medieval grimoires, the true names of demons confer power, but in Lovecraft's world, naming confers only collapse. Cthulhu is not a key, but a contagion. Its utterance does not summon, it infects. The very structure of the word, unvoiced consonants, liquid fricatives, and guttural stresses, suggests a throat unfit for human speech. Language fails not because it is inadequate, but because it encounters something that corrodes its coherence. In this way, Lovecraft weaponizes etymology against the reader. What should bring clarity instead deepens disorientation. This principle finds its most concentrated expression in the infamous cult chant, Funglui Magruanaf, Cthulhu Rulia Wuganagal Ftagen, often rendered by fans as, in his house at Rulia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. the phrase operates as more than esoteric flavor text. It is a symbol of semantic contamination, a sentence that appears translatable, but carries beneath it layers of corruption. The chant's apparent structure mimics human language, suggesting verb forms and possessives, yet each word stutters against phonetic familiarity. This linguistic mimicry is crucial. The chant masquerades as meaning while undermining it. It is not simply cryptic, but anti-semantic, a string of syllables that imply sense only to dissolve it. We must recognize that the chant functions as a ritual of epistemic erosion. The more one attempts to understand, the more meaning unravels. Language, in Lovecraft's mythos, does not reveal, it transmits. Cthulhu does not speak, and yet he communicates through dreams, architecture, and madness. His messages are not linguistic, but symptomatic. Dreams infected by his presence cause individuals to sculpt unnameable idols, to utter fragments of impossible speech, to draw maps of R'lyeh they have never seen. These manifestations do not carry knowledge in the conventional sense. They are the knowledge. In Lovecraft's cosmology, language becomes viral, bypassing the rational mind and embedding itself in the unconscious. This aligns disturbingly with certain strands of early 20th century linguistics, particularly those influenced by Freud and Saussure, which emphasize the instability of signifiers and the deep reservoirs of the unconscious. In this context, Cthulhu's communication is neither divine revelation nor coded message. It is psychic invasion. Consider carefully the architecture of R'lyeh, described in the Call of Cthulhu as greenish stone blocks hewn into the form of great bas-reliefs, writing of some unknown hieroglyphic type. These inscriptions are never translated nor even deciphered. Their presence serves not to clarify, but to mark a boundary, the limit beyond which human cognition disintegrates. They resemble language, but resist interpretation, much like the chant. This is not accidental. R'lyeh itself can be read as a linguistic metaphor, a sunken grammar that rises only to destabilize understanding. Its non-Euclidean geometry mimics syntactical structures that loop back on themselves, defying linearity and collapsing coherence. Thus, the city and the word form a symbolic dyad. Both represent submerged systems of meaning, both gesture toward knowledge, and both conceal an unspeakable core. We see similar linguistic phenomena in other parts of the mythos. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, is written in cursed languages, Arabic, Greek, Latin, and each translation is said to degrade the original meaning. The idea of untranslatability recurs again and again, suggesting that meaning itself is corrosive at certain depths. Even the name of the book's supposed author, Abdul al-Hazred, is a linguistic misfire. Scholars have long pointed out that it is grammatically incorrect Arabic, yet that error is the point. It creates a simulacrum of authenticity, a ghost of credibility that ultimately undermines itself. Lovecraft builds entire structures of horror from the erosion of linguistic trust. The reader, like the scholar in his stories, approaches texts expecting clarity, only to encounter layers of semantic decay. It is not simply a book of spells, but a monument to unreadability. The symbolic function of language in Lovecraft thus operates on multiple levels. First, as an invitation to the unknown. Names and chants lure both character and reader deeper into mystery. Second, as a method of destabilization, what seems like meaning turns out to be semantic quicksand. Third, as a mirror of madness, language becomes a symptom rather than a tool, reflecting internal disintegration. In this triadic system, the very act of reading or speaking becomes suspect. Words are no longer safe containers of thought. They are porous, unstable, possibly haunted. We might say that Lovecraft's language performs the very horror it describes. The name Cthulhu does not merely represent terror. It is terror, embedded phonetically, symbolically, and psychologically. One must also note the circular repetition of specific terms throughout Lovecraft's stories: cyclopean, eldritch, non-Euclidean, blasphemous. These words recur not because they clarify, but because they ritualize. They form a lexicon of inexact horror, each appearance reinforcing the others without ever resolving into a stable definition. The language loops back upon itself, mimicking the narrative structure of the mythos as a whole. Cthulhu never wakes, the meaning never settles, and the words continue to circle. This rhetorical strategy ensures that horror is sustained through incompletion. The reader remains suspended, not enlightened, not ignorant, but caught in a semantic undertow. If Lovecraft's language destabilizes understanding, his narrative technique reasserts structure, not to resolve the horror, but to ground it in a framework that feels unnervingly credible. His stories do not unfold through conventional linear storytelling, but through fragments, recovered documents, personal letters, academic reports, and newspaper clippings. This documentary style functions not only as a stylistic choice, but as a philosophical strategy. It presents fiction as fact, embedding the impossible within the plausible. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, pieces together disparate accounts from his late grand-uncle's papers, constructing a horror he never directly witnesses. We must recognize what this narrative deferral accomplishes. It withholds certainty while building the illusion of authenticity. The myth of Cthulhu feels ancient, not because it is told as myth, but because it is revealed as research. This is not merely storytelling, it is fictional archaeology. Lovecraft's myth-building mimics the methodologies of historical scholarship and folklore studies. His protagonists often resemble cultural anthropologists, assembling oral traditions, tribal symbols, and regional rumors into an emergent worldview. This is particularly evident in the story's treatment of the Cthulhu cult, whose global presence, spanning Louisiana swamps, Inuit carvings, and Pacific islands, suggests a unified but buried mythos. The pattern is unmistakable. Disparate, primitive cultures share a common memory of the old ones, yet crucially, this memory is never complete. Each testimony is partial, corrupted, obscured by fear or madness. Here, Lovecraft reproduces the logic of real-world myth. Consistency across cultures implies antiquity, but the gaps suggest something older than language itself. It is not the presence of the cult that lends Cthulhu mythic weight. It is the incompleteness of their knowledge, the fragments that hint at a whole too vast to assemble. This fragmentary storytelling also mirrors how myth functions in oral traditions. Myths are not static texts, but living structures passed from voice to voice, always shifting in the telling. Lovecraft replicates this instability through nested narrators and layered accounts. In The Call of Cthulhu, we hear from Inspector Legrasse, who heard from a cultist who quoted a chant. We read Thurston's notes on Angel's research on Johansson's account. This recursive narrative structure not only mimics real ethnographic documentation, it places the reader in the position of interpreter. The horror becomes participatory. One is not told about Cthulhu. One uncovers him, piece by piece, always through someone else's lens. And in this process, the myth gains authority. It is not proclaimed, it is discovered. Another key element of Lovecraft's myth building is the use of invented yet consistent references, texts, places, names that reappear across his stories. The Necronomicon, Miskatonic University, Arkham, and Innsmouth form a shared world whose continuity gives the illusion of historicity. Lovecraft's casual references to these entities within otherwise unconnected tales replicate the techniques of historical documentation. When a fictional grimoire is cited across multiple texts, when towns appear with established geographies and internal lore, they accrue the weight of fact, not truth, but familiarity. The repeated invocation of ancient tomes, eldritch texts, and blasphemous rites forms a symbolic infrastructure. Each term is vague in isolation, but becomes potent through repetition. As with religious language, the words gain meaning not through precision, but through usage. The myth, like liturgy, survives by rhythm. We must consider the role of unreliable narrators in this architecture of credibility. Lovecraft's protagonists are almost always rationalists, scholars, scientists, antiquarians, who begin as skeptics and end as broken vessels of revelation. Their transformations serve a dual purpose. On one hand, their initial skepticism mirrors the reader's own, anchoring the story in rational inquiry. On the other, their eventual collapse provides the emotional evidence for the myth's veracity. These are not believers, they are victims of belief. Their narratives are not testimonials of faith, but post-mortems of sanity. This duality lends Lovecraft's mythos a disturbing credibility. If even the most rational minds succumb to the myth, then perhaps the myth holds truth that reason cannot digest. It is not that these narrators want to believe, it's that belief becomes inescapable. Lovecraft also deploys techniques reminiscent of hoax literature and pseudo-history. He blurs the line between documented and invented material so effectively that many readers have mistaken the Necronomicon for a real text. This is not accidental. The inclusion of fabricated citations, false bibliographies, and fictional academics such as Dr. Shrewsbury or Johannes Cabot creates an atmosphere of scholarly authenticity. Like the forged grimoires of medieval Europe or the apocryphal texts of the occult revival, these inventions operate as mechanisms of belief. Not X, but Y. It is not that Lovecraft expects the reader to believe literally, but rather to suspend disbelief structurally. The story becomes a ritual of plausibility. The more it resembles a historical record, the more it erodes the boundary between fiction and myth. This brings us to an unsettling implication. Lovecraft's mythos is designed not to convince, but to linger. The dream of Cthulhu persists not because it is asserted, but because it is half remembered. Its power lies in suggestion, in the sense that something vast exists just beyond the veil of documentation. Every article, every carving, every scribbled note becomes a relic of a deeper horror. The reader, like the narrator, assembles these fragments but never completes the picture. That incompletion is the point. Myth does not need confirmation, it needs recurrence. The old ones do not need to rise to exist. They exist because we keep repeating their names, copying their symbols, dreaming their geometries. Consider carefully how this differs from conventional horror. Most stories build to climax and resolution. Lovecraft's build to implication and silence. There is no confrontation, only accumulation. No revelation, only erosion. The myth remains intact precisely because the story never breaks it open. The truth of Cthulhu is always deferred, always out of reach, and thus forever fertile. His sleep, like the myth itself, persists because it cannot be fully known. To awaken the god would be to exhaust the story, but as long as he slumbers, we continue to interpret, to investigate, to believe. At the heart of Cthulhu's myth lies a set of philosophical concepts that destabilize the very foundations of Western thought. Where traditional narratives often locate human beings as agents of meaning, Lovecraft's vision removes that anchor entirely. The myth of the sleeping god is not simply a narrative device, it is a philosophical provocation. What if reality itself is structured not around clarity or order, but around insignificance, entropy, and dreamlike unreality? These are not themes inserted into the myth. They are the myth. Cthulhu does not symbolize destruction or salvation. He symbolizes something far more disquieting, the possibility that nothing was ever about us to begin with. And in such a cosmos, awakening is not a moment of clarity, it is annihilation. The first and most pervasive concept is insignificance. In the Call of Cthulhu, the narrator remarks, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity." This is not metaphorical rhetoric, it is philosophical orientation. Human beings, Lovecraft suggests, are not the culmination of evolution or the stewards of creation. We are incidental, flickering organisms clinging to a surface we do not understand. Cthulhu's sleep reinforces this position. He dreams not because we matter to him, but because we do not. We are insects fluttering near a dormant engine. Our existence registers only as noise in his dream. This is not a universe of divine plans or moral orders. It is a universe of scale, of forces so vast that recognition would be madness. The fact that Cthulhu sleeps is not comforting. It is indifferent. This doctrine of insignificance is intensified by entropy, the second pillar of Lovecraft's cosmology. Entropy, in thermodynamic terms, is the tendency of all systems toward disorder and decay. But in Lovecraft, it becomes metaphysical. His universe is not static, but disintegrating. Ruins within ruins, myths built on collapsed civilizations, knowledge that fragments rather than accumulates. Consider the city of Relia, described as built in measureless eons behind history. It is not alive, but decaying in suspension. Cthulhu's sleep is not peaceful, it is rotting. His slumber reflects the cosmic principle that even the most powerful entities succumb to time's unraveling. We must recognize that this view of entropy does not simply mark the end of things, it marks their futility. What begins will not endure. What endures does so only as husk. Awakening, then, becomes impossible, not because the stars forbid it, but because the very structure of the cosmos trends toward forgetfulness. The third, and perhaps most elusive concept, is dream reality. Cthulhu lies dreaming, and those dreams seep into human minds, infecting art, vision, and memory. But what exactly is dream in this context? It is not escapism, it is not metaphor. Dream here is ontological uncertainty, a realm where reality is not fixed, where time folds, where perception becomes unreliable. This resonates with early 20th century developments in quantum physics, where the observer collapses the waveform, and with philosophical idealism, which questions whether the external world exists independently of mind. Lovecraft does not resolve this tension, he embeds it. Earthia, as a city of strange angles, which were not right angles, exemplifies this liminality. It is both real and unreal, present and submerged, part of the world and outside of it. Cthulhu's dream is the condition of our world, not a parallel to it, but its substrate. We must pause here, for this reveals something profound, that in Lovecraft's cosmology, the boundary between reality and dream is not a line, but a veil. His entities do not exist elsewhere. They are the elsewhere embedded within the here. This metaphysical entanglement has a chilling implication. If Cthulhu dreams the world, then to awaken him is to end the distinction between dreaming and waking. That is not enlightenment. That is collapse. To awaken Cthulhu would not mean he steps onto our shores. It would mean our shores dissolve into the ocean of his mind. Thus, his slumber becomes a metaphysical containment. The dream is not his prison. It is ours. These philosophical threads echo through Lovecraft's broader oeuvre. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the narrator uncovers truths so vast that he abandons the illusion of safety in knowledge. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist exchanges minds with a being from a past-future civilization, experiencing consciousness across non-linear time. In both stories, as in The Call of Cthulhu, discovery does not illuminate, it corrodes. Knowledge is not revelation, but disintegration. The more one sees, the less one remains human. Here we find a stark inversion of Enlightenment ideals. Not X, but Y. It is not ignorance that is dangerous, but knowing. Cthulhu never wakes, not because he cannot, but because the mind that fully grasps him would cease to function. His slumber protects not him from us, but us from him. Cthulhu's slumber, then, can be understood as a metaphor for a pre-human reality, a state of being unconditioned by language, identity, or perception. To awaken Cthulhu is to awaken a world without self. This aligns with the concept of the sublime in philosophical aesthetics. For Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant, the sublime was that which exceeds comprehension. Vast mountains, infinite space, the divine. But where Kant's sublime maintains a moral boundary between self and terror, Lovecraft's sublime collapses it. The terror is not distant, it is internalized. We are already within Cthulhu's dream. The sea does not separate us, it permeates us. The stars are not misaligned, they are indifferent. The sleeping god is not waiting, he is being in a mode beyond awakening. One might ask, why not end the myth with revelation? Why not let Cthulhu rise? The answer lies in Lovecraft's understanding of horror as asymptotic. True cosmic horror, he implies, is not an event, but a limit. The terror lies in approach, in sensing that one is always nearing but never reaching the abyss. R'lyeh rises briefly and sinks again. Cthulhu stirs, but does not act. The myth oscillates between presence and absence. This is not failure of narrative. It is its perfection. The myth sustains itself precisely because it withholds resolution. Like entropy, it increases through decay. Like dreams, it persists through fragmentation. Like insignificance, it deepens through repetition. Lovecraft's cosmos is not ruled by a single god, but by a labyrinthine pantheon of forces, vast, contradictory, and often mutually indifferent. The sleeping Cthulhu is only one participant in this unholy ecology. To grasp why he never truly wakes, we must consider his position among the other entities that populate Lovecraft's universe, the great old ones, the outer gods, and the dreamlike intermediaries who bridge human perception and cosmic truth. In this hierarchy of sleep and wakefulness, Cthulhu occupies a liminal role, neither dead nor active, neither god nor beast, but a dreamer whose consciousness radiates outward as infection. The relationships among these beings are not moral or familial, but gravitational. They exist as fields of influence, overlapping realities whose interactions produce what we mistake for the world. The great old ones, of which Cthulhu is the most iconic, are not creators in any theological sense. They are remnants, entities from earlier cycles of existence, lingering in dormancy until the universe's conditions once again align with their being. In the Dunwich Horror, Lovecraft hints at beings who once ruled the earth and now sleep beneath it, suggesting that their awakening would not be an invasion but a restoration. Their slumber is therefore cyclical, not accidental. It mirrors geological time, in which continents rise and sink, species emerge and vanish. Cthulhu's repose in R'lyeh embodies this deep temporal rhythm, a mythic metaphor for the planet's own unconscious. We must recognize that Lovecraft's horror here is ecological rather than apocalyptic. The gods are not coming to destroy our world. They are our world's earlier inhabitants returning to claim what was never truly ours. Above the old ones exist the outer gods, beings like Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep. These are not sleeping, because sleep implies distinction between activity and rest, between mind and matter. They are chaos itself, omnipresent yet mindless, infinite yet self-consuming. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, eternally whirls at the center of the cosmos, surrounded by demonic flutes that keep the universe in rhythmic stasis. In this mythology, Cthulhu's dreaming mirrors Azathoth's, though at a smaller scale. Both embody the same principle, the universe as unthinking dream. The difference lies only in scope. While Azathoth dreams the cosmos entire, Cthulhu dreams within it, a reflection nested inside a reflection. Thus, when we say Cthulhu sleeps, we are really describing the fractal structure of Lovecraft's reality. Smaller consciousnesses trapped within the greater unconsciousness of existence itself. Not hierarchy, but recursion. If Azathoth represents chaos and Cthulhu dormancy, then Nyarlathotep stands as the anomaly, an emissary that moves between dreaming and waking. Called the crawling chaos, he manifests across human history as prophet, scientist, or trickster, always serving as mediator between incomprehensible gods and fragile humanity. Through Nyarlathotep, the sleeping cosmos whispers into our world. His multiplicity, 1,000 forms and faces, contrasts sharply with Cthulhu's stillness. While Cthulhu sleeps beneath the sea, Nyarlathotep walks among us, conducting the will of an unconscious pantheon. Yet his motives are not clear. He delights in revelation that destroys sanity. This tension between Cthulhu's immobility and Nyarlathotep's ceaseless activity defines Lovecraft's metaphysics, the interplay between the inert and the invasive. Cthulhu cannot wake because Nyarlathotep never sleeps. The dream must continue, and someone must administer it. The dreamlands offer another layer of this cosmological structure, introduced in stories such as the dream quest of unknown Kadath. This dimension is not separate from reality, but adjacent to it, accessible through unconsciousness. It is a geography of the mind, where entities like the gods of earth dwell in perpetual twilight. Cthulhu's connection to the dreamlands is implicit rather than direct. His influence seeps through dream itself, shaping the imagery of the sleeping mind. In this sense, he is the subconscious of the dreamlands, a deep current beneath its surface. The dreamers who glimpse R'lyeh or chant his name do not travel outward. They descend inward into the substrate of thought that underlies all reality. This is Lovecraft's ultimate inversion. The cosmos is not an external space to be explored, but a collective dream whose origin lies in something asleep and alien. We dream because he dreams. Cthulhu's partial awakening, described in The Call of Cthulhu, briefly illustrates how these entities interact with the material world. When the stars are right, R'lyeh rises from the ocean, disturbing the geometries of time and space. The description is both physical and metaphysical. The nightmare corpse city rose once more to the surface of the earth, and the titanic thing from beyond the stars shook the sea with its awakening. Yet the awakening is temporary. The stars soon turn wrong, and the city sinks again. This rhythm suggests that cosmic alignment is fleeting, that the fabric of existence occasionally permits intrusion before restoring its slumber. The implication is profound. Reality itself resists awakening. Cthulhu's sleep is not mere rest. It is the universe's equilibrium. When he stirs, order unravels. When he sinks, balance returns. The world persists only because the cosmos continues to dream itself stable. We must pause here, for this reveals something crucial about Lovecraft's theology of inertia. His universe is not governed by will, but by momentum. The old ones do not choose to sleep. They are bound by the entropy of existence. Cthulhu's slumber is not exile. It is the default state of all being. In this sense, awakening will require a violation of cosmic law. The stars' alignment, the cult's rituals, the human madness, all these attempts to wake him are like sparks against an ocean. They flicker, but the deep remains unmoved. We might compare this to certain strains of ancient philosophy, Heraclitus's ever-living fire, or the Stoic notion of cyclical conflagration, where the universe burns and cools in endless succession. Lovecraft's cosmos, however, never completes its cycle. It remains frozen mid-turn, the dream half-formed, the awakening forever deferred. The other great old ones, Dagon, Hastur, Tsathoggua, Yig, serve to reinforce this metaphysical ecology. Each rules a distinct domain of stasis, the deep sea, the void between stars, the subterranean dark, the reptilian past. None act with purpose, they emanate. Their existence demonstrates that cosmic horror is not monotheistic, but polychoral, a symphony of silences, each resonating at a different frequency. When humans encounter these beings, the result is not revelation, but fragmentation. Madness, in Lovecraft, is the human reaction to ontological multiplicity, the mind's refusal to remain coherent when faced with too many realities. Not one God to understand, but countless, none of whom acknowledge understanding as possible. Thus, Cthulhu's sleep is not isolation. It is harmony within an orchestra of dormancy. Even the sea itself functions as an entity, a medium through which these forces express inertia. In Lovecraft's fiction, the ocean is both womb and tomb, the element of suspension. It preserves and conceals, moving according to tides older than the moon. Cthulhu's residence within it is not arbitrary, it is thematic. Water is the primal state of undifferentiation, predating consciousness, language, and form. To sink into the sea is to regress toward the unformed. In this way, R'lyeh's submersion mirrors humanity's repression of cosmic truth. The waters hold what consciousness cannot. We must recognize the poetic precision of this choice. Cthulhu sleeps beneath the waves because the unconscious itself is maritime, deep, shifting, and ancient. In Lovecraft's cosmology, the boundary between gods and humans is porous, not in proximity, but in influence. Humanity exists not beside the cosmic entities, but within their dream. Thus, every interaction with these beings is not a meeting of separate realities, but a momentary overlap between fragments of the same unconscious continuum. When humans dream of Cthulhu, they are not perceiving an external entity. They are registering the tremors of their own ontological instability. Madness, then, becomes the natural consequence of contact. It is not simply a psychological breakdown, but a necessary adjustment to a truth that the human mind was never evolved to perceive. The horror of Lovecraft's mythos lies not in monsters attacking from beyond, but in consciousness cracking from within. The most direct depiction of this contact occurs in the Call of Cthulhu, where artists and poets dreamed feverishly, and the minds of sensitive men were shaken by revelations. These individuals are not chosen prophets, but unwilling receivers of transmission. They experience visions of Relia rising, of alien geometries and monstrous deities, but they cannot interpret them coherently. Their creative outbursts, paintings, sculptures, or fragmented writings become artifacts of contamination. Here, the line between inspiration and infection collapses. We must recognize that Lovecraft's portrayal of creativity anticipates the modern concept of the unconscious as a site of invasion. The artist is not original. He is porous. To dream of Cthulhu is to momentarily host his thought. The price of that moment is coherence. The result is what the narrator calls a curious fever of dreams, a phrase that encapsulates both awakening and illness, both revelation and decay. Madness, in this framework, serves as a protective mechanism. In the Call of Cthulhu, those who see the god directly either die, go insane, or repress the memory entirely. Captain Johansen, the sailor who witnesses Cthulhu's brief rising, returns mute and catatonic, unable to describe what he saw. His silence is not cowardice, it is defense. The mind, encountering an ontology it cannot categorize, retreats into fragmentation. Lovecraft's characters often survive not by understanding, but by refusing to understand. This reversal transforms madness from failure into salvation. Consider carefully what this implies. Insanity is not the opposite of reason, but its boundary. It is the point where reason, confronted by the absolute, preserves itself through collapse. To remain sane in Lovecraft's universe would be the true madness. To continue believing in human significance when the cosmos denies it. This dynamic is echoed in The Whisperer in Darkness, where the protagonist Ackley encounters alien beings capable of removing human consciousness and preserving it in metal cylinders. The horror is not the loss of the body, but the retention of awareness in a context stripped of human meaning. This, too, is a form of madness, not chaotic delusion, but unbearable clarity. Similarly, in The Shadow over Innsmouth, the protagonist's gradual discovery of his own hybrid nature leads to an existential unraveling. He realizes that his nightmares are ancestral memories, that his destiny is not human, but aquatic. His final acceptance, "I shall dwell with them in wonder and glory forever," reads as both liberation and damnation. In Lovecraft, revelation and insanity are twins. To know one's true place in the cosmos is to become something else, something incompatible with sanity. Cults and secret societies within Lovecraft's fiction provide another layer to this interaction. These groups do not worship Cthulhu in the conventional sense. They remember him. Their chants and rituals function less as devotion than as synchronization. When they repeat, "Funglui Mangulunaf, Cthulhu Relieh, nagelftang. They align their psychic rhythms with the dreaming god. Madness here becomes collective, an organized descent into shared delirium. The cult's purpose is not to awaken Cthulhu literally, but to dissolve the boundary between dreaming and waking within themselves. By doing so, they approach what might be called ontological contagion. In a sense, they are already part of the awakening process. Lovecraft's genius lies in presenting this not as demonic possession, but as cognitive resonance. The worshippers are not deceived. They are in tune with a deeper frequency of existence, one that civilization has forgotten. We must pause here to note how Lovecraft's portrayal of madness parallels early 20th century psychology. Freud's theories of repression and the unconscious were revolutionizing thought when Lovecraft wrote. The idea that dreams reveal hidden truths of the psyche resonates with Cthulhu's dream transmissions. However, where Freud's unconscious contains personal desires, Lovecraft's contains cosmic realities. That ye becomes abyss. Jung's notion of the collective unconscious finds its grotesque corollary in the Cthulhu cult's shared visions, symbols too ancient to be human, archetypes that predate the species, not X, but Y. It is not the psyche reflecting the cosmos, but the cosmos intruding upon the psyche. Madness, therefore, is not delusion. It is perception unfiltered. The insane are not wrong. They are simply awake in a way that the sane cannot survive. Lovecraft's narratives also explore madness as a communicable condition. The reports of collective nightmares, of sculptors sculpting what they have never seen, imply that Cthulhu's dream is viral. Knowledge spreads through psychic contagion rather than rational discourse. The act of reading, too, becomes dangerous. The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu admits, "I shall not be surprised if my manuscript ends as did my uncle's, locked away for the sake of the world." Knowledge is infection, documentation, transmission. We might compare this to the ancient myth of the Gorgon, whose face turns those who gaze upon it to stone. In Lovecraft's world, written testimony performs the same petrification. The researcher, by recording horror, spreads it. The reader, by encountering it, inherits it. Thus, even the scholar becomes a vector. This recursive contamination ensures that Cthulhu never needs to rise. His dream travels through language itself. The function of madness culminates in the paradox of epistemic containment. The mythos sustains itself by promising revelation while ensuring that revelation destroys the observer. Each encounter ends in silence or death. Each discovery births a warning. This narrative structure reproduces the very logic of Cthulhu's slumber. Knowledge must remain partial, or the system collapses. The dream cannot fully translate into waking reality without annihilating it. This paradox gives the myth its longevity. Like the dream that never concludes, the story never closes. Cthulhu never wakes because the human mind cannot remain intact if he does. Madness thus serves the cosmos as a stabilizing mechanism. The universe dreams through us, but sanity limits the transmission. We are filters, not recipients. In Lovecraft's mythos, knowledge is not liberating. It does not open doors to empowerment, nor lead upward toward enlightenment. Instead, it plunges downward into chasms of disorientation and terror. The notion of forbidden knowledge in his fiction is not a moral prohibition, but an ontological warning. There are truths so vast, so alien to the structure of human thought, that to comprehend them is to disassemble the knower. Cthulhu never truly wakes because knowledge of him collapses the architecture of meaning. In this universe, epistemology, the study of knowing, is a suicide pact. To understand too much is to cease being able to interpret reality at all. The most prominent fictional embodiment of this danger is the Necronomicon, the infamous mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred's tome of cursed knowledge. Supposedly penned in Damascus around 730 CE, the text promises to reveal the hidden origins of the cosmos, the existence of the old ones, and rituals of summoning or banishment. But every encounter with the Necronomicon ends in madness, death, or disappearance. It is not simply a book of forbidden facts. It is an artifact that undoes cognition. In the Dunwich Horror, the mere act of reading it allows Wilbur Whateley to commune with entities beyond space and time, while his brother, an invisible abomination, must be destroyed using one of its incantations. Yet, even the successful containment brings no clarity. The knowledge gained is unusable except as a last resort, and always at a price. Consider this carefully. In Lovecraft's fiction, the price of understanding is the loss of one's position as a subject capable of meaning-making. This dynamic defines what scholars have called epistemic collapse, a failure not only of facts or theories, but of the entire scaffolding that allows facts to cohere. In The Call of Cthulhu, when Francis Wayland Thurston compiles accounts of global psychic disturbances, he begins to suspect a deeper pattern, a hidden order. But as the pieces accumulate, coherence begins to unravel. The narrative doesn't culminate in revelation, but in dread. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents, he writes. This is not poetic pessimism. It is a statement of metaphysical law. The human mind must fail to correlate, or else the correlated pattern, the whole truth, will dissolve the very structure of mind. Not ignorance as failure, but ignorance as design. Cthulhu's sleep persists because the world depends on the impossibility of knowing him fully. This notion reframes the idea of secrets within the mythos. Unlike traditional horror, where secret knowledge is hidden and must be uncovered, Lovecraftian horror suggests the reverse. The secrets are always there, but we lack the capacity to truly see them. The cults, the texts, the dreams, all are fragments, not puzzles to be solved, but symptoms of a deeper infection. Once awareness begins, it cannot be reversed, only deferred. And this partial awareness, almost knowing, becomes the engine of horror. The mind hovers over a void it cannot name. Thus, the forbidden is not locked away. It is always seeping through. Cthulhu's dream is not contained in Rolia. It is broadcast in symbols, instincts, and intuitions. And the more one tries to interpret them, the more unstable the interpreter becomes. Lovecraft weaponizes this instability through a specific narrative strategy, the doomed investigator. In The Shadow, out of time, Professor Peasley experiences a period of amnesia, only to discover later that his consciousness was displaced by a member of the great race of Yith, an alien civilization that projects minds across time. His attempt to understand this leads him into a spiral of journals, dreams, and archaeological fragments that all point toward an unbearable truth. His mind was never his own. Knowledge, in this story, literally displaces the self. The more Peasley learns, the more fragile his identity becomes. Similarly, in At the Mountains of Madness, the Miskatonic expedition discovers the remnants of the elder things and the artificial species, the Shoggoths. The knowledge uncovered in the ruins suggests not only that life on Earth was engineered, but that it has already been superseded by other intelligences. The narrative's conclusion, an urgent plea not to continue the investigation, echoes across Lovecraft's work. The warning is always the same. To know too much is to dissolve the boundaries that make thought possible. We must also consider the linguistic element of epistemic collapse. As discussed in 1.3, Lovecraft's invented languages, cultic chants, and alien terms function as destabilizing symbols. The words Funglui, Mugruwanaf, Cthulhu, Relief, Waganagel, Vtagen do not convey information, they undo it. The utterance of such phrases infects rather than informs. In this context, reading becomes a form of summoning. Speaking becomes a form of contamination. The act of naming Cthulhu draws the speaker into his dream. Language, which in Western philosophy is often seen as the primary tool of rationality, becomes the medium of madness, not communication, but collapse. And this aligns with broader philosophical anxieties of Lovecraft's era. Saussure's theory of the arbitrary sign, Wittgenstein's limits of language, and Nietzsche's claim that truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. In Lovecraft, language fails not at its edges, but at its core. There is, finally, a theological shadow beneath all of this. Lovecraft's universe is not atheistic in the traditional sense. It is post-theistic. The gods exist, but they do not offer meaning. Their existence does not sanctify the cosmos. It invalidates it. The Necronomicon says, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die." This line, often quoted, suggests the instability of even death itself, but its deeper implication is epistemic. Even the categories we rely upon, life, death, time, thought, are temporary. The gods are not supernatural, they are supranatural. Their existence ruptures nature from the inside out, and in this rupture, knowledge becomes dangerous not because it challenges belief, but because it renders belief irrelevant. We must recognize what this reveals. Cthulhu's sleep is not simply an allegory for unknowing, but a model of the universe. He does not dream passively. He generates the conditions under which knowing becomes impossible. His slumber is the architecture of mystery itself. To awaken him would be to destroy the very veil that makes thought sustainable. Therefore, he must never rise, not out of pity or limitation, but out of cosmic necessity. His unawakened state maintains the illusion of separateness, of order, of reason. It is the thin surface on which cognition balances. To disturb it is to plunge into a reality for which our categories have no use. The figure of Cthulhu first emerges fully formed in the 1926 short story, The Call of Cthulhu, but the thematic and symbolic architecture supporting him had already begun to crystallize in Lovecraft's earlier works. To understand why Cthulhu never wakes, we must begin not only with this inaugural appearance, but also with the intertextual web Lovecraft constructs around it. His mythos is not linear, but recursive, composed of layered references, foreshadowed terrors, and deliberately ambiguous connections. Cthulhu's role in the mythos is less that of an actor and more that of a gravitational center, an idea so massive that other stories bend toward it. His sleep becomes not merely a plot point, but a structural device, determining how and why stories unfold as they do. In Dagon, 1917, we see the germ of what will become the Cthulhu mythos. The unnamed narrator, a war veteran addicted to morphine, recounts his experience of encountering a monolithic creature in a newly risen section of seafloor. He writes, "I think I went mad then, of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff. I remember little. Here we encounter motifs that would recur in the Call of Cthulhu, the sea yielding ancient truths, madness as the only viable response, and the impossibility of fully recounting the event. The creature in Dagon is never named, yet it anticipates the deep ones, and perhaps Cthulhu himself. This tale marks the initial appearance of what we might call Lovecraft's submerged truth aesthetic, a narrative technique where knowledge surfaces only briefly, incompletely, and with catastrophic results. The Nameless City, 1921, furthers this thematic trajectory. In it, the protagonist explores ancient ruins in the Arabian desert, encountering a civilization not only pre-human, but structurally alien. He reads fragments that suggest the gods of a later race drove them into hiding before the beginning of history, and finds evidence of immense reptilian entities whose architecture was not meant for human bodies. Although Cthulhu is never named, the story introduces the idea of pre-human intelligences and the persistence of their artifacts in the present. Not X, but Y. It is not history that ends in ruins, but ruins that begin a new kind of history, one in which human comprehension is incidental. The idea that these ruins remain asleep beneath the conscious world parallels Cthulhu's dormancy in Rohlia. In both cases, the past has not died. It has merely been forgotten, waiting to reassert itself when conditions allow. The publication of The Call of Cthulhu in 1928 marked the first full articulation of these themes. Structured as a dossier compiled by a skeptical academic, the story contains multiple nested narratives, a technique that mirrors the layers of dream and reality surrounding Cthulhu himself. Through newspaper clippings, diary entries, and first-hand accounts, we learn that a strange earthquake in the South Pacific has caused the sunken city of Rolia to rise briefly to the surface. Sailors encounter an immense tentacled creature and flee in terror. One survives to tell the tale, but even he eventually disappears. The story's most iconic line, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die," originates here, a pseudo-translation from the Necronomicon that defines Cthulhu's paradoxical state. He is dead yet dreaming, inert yet active, a god whose very sleep bends the minds of those who sense him. This contradictory logic becomes the myth's heartbeat. The idea of the eternally lying dead positions Cthulhu as a being outside linear time. His awakening would not be a new event, but a return, a re-entrance into a state humanity is not prepared to inhabit. The influence of this foundational story ripples outward into tales that do not feature Cthulhu directly, but reinforce the mythos he anchors. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, the Mygo, fungoid extraterrestrials from Yugoth, collect human brains and store them in metallic canisters for interstellar transport. While not servants of Cthulhu, their methods and goals parallel those of the cults described in The Call of Cthulhu. The Mygo operate on timescales and ethical frameworks alien to human concerns. Their casual treatment of identity and form echoes Cthulhu's dream realm, where consciousness becomes fluid and unstable. The indirect connection reinforces the idea that the mythos is a shared ecology, not a centralized theology. Cthulhu does not appear, but his influence persists in the thematic architecture, displacement, secrecy, and the collapse of identity in the face of the alien. The Dunwich Horror, 1929, introduces the Whateleys and the invisible terror born of Yog-Sothoth, another major figure in the mythos. Though the entity in question is not Cthulhu, the story's structure mirrors the call of Cthulhu in key ways. A mysterious rural cult, a monstrous offspring, forbidden knowledge encoded in ancient texts, and the climactic revelation that humanity has once again brushed up against the incomprehensible. Importantly, this story expands the idea that the old ones do not act so much as reside. They exist in slumber, in half-presence, shaping the world through indirect means, through dreams, bloodlines, symbols. Their actions are not narrative events, but environmental conditions. Cthulhu's dream is not an interjection into the world. It is the medium through which the world itself unfolds. These early stories form a lattice of implications rather than a cohesive mythology. Lovecraft resisted the idea of a structured pantheon or consistent cosmology. He described his creations as tools, symbols for expressing his philosophy of cosmic indifference. Thus, when later writers attempted to codify the mythos, they were arguably working against its very design. Lovecraft's own intertextual strategy was one of suggestion, not exposition. He planted references across texts, Arkham, Miskatonic University, the Necronomicon, not to unify the mythos, but to echo its themes. Each story vibrates with traces of others, creating a literary dreamscape where meaning flickers at the edge of recognition. Cthulhu's name may not appear in every tale, but his logic, his dormant influence, saturates the structure. We must recognize that Cthulhu's first appearances are partial by design. He is not the subject of the story, but its gravitational field. In this, Lovecraft anticipates postmodern strategies of fragmented narrative and metafictional layering. The stories do not seek closure, they seek expansion through hints, through rumors, through dreams. The result is a mythology that reads like a half-forgotten memory, familiar in shape, disturbing in detail, and always on the edge of returning. This mythos does not operate like a religion, with doctrines and origin stories. It operates like a virus, spreading laterally, mutating through repetition, and embedding itself within the cultural unconscious. The Call of Cthulhu, written 1926, published 1928, is not merely the debut of Lovecraft's most iconic entity. It is the blueprint of his entire cosmic horror ethos. More than any other tale, it embodies the mythic logic that defines Cthulhu's nature. A god who cannot rise, a knowledge that cannot be known, and a narrative that cannot be resolved. Structured as a series of nested accounts, it advances its terror through implication and accumulation rather than climax. Most importantly, it establishes the thematic necessity of Cthulhu's slumber. His dream is not merely an element of plot, but a containment of chaos within narrative form itself. In this story, Lovecraft teaches us how to glimpse the abyss, never to gaze fully into it. The story's structure reflects this constraint. Told by Francis Wayland Thurston, a Boston academic, the narrative begins as a personal investigation into his late great-uncle's papers. These papers contain fragments, a sculptor's night terrors, a police raid on a backwater cult in Louisiana, and a sailor's account of a mysterious island rising from the sea. The brilliance of this format lies in its refusal to offer direct experience. Cthulhu himself does not speak or act within the story. He is witnessed fleetingly by second-hand sources, and even then only through dreams or fragments. The horror never comes fully into view, and the protagonist himself remains at a distance. We must recognize that this distance is not merely a literary device. It is metaphysical. The story enacts the very boundary it describes. Full knowledge is always deferred, because full contact would destroy the story's ability to tell itself. The most iconic moment occurs during the brief resurfacing of Rolia, when the crew of the Alert encounters the city and the creature. Johansen, the surviving sailor, describes the city as possessing angles which were acute, but behaved as if they were obtuse, an impossible geometry that warps perception itself. When the sailors unwittingly open a door, or perhaps merely perceive one, Cthulhu emerges. A mountain walked or stumbled. This phrase does not clarify. It confounds. It situates the creature not in taxonomy, but in metaphor. Cthulhu is not defined by appearance, but by the breakdown of descriptive language. Even as he rises, he remains submerged in the reader's imagination. The God's awakening is not a dramatic entrance. It is a moment of narrative slippage, where perception fails and the mind recoils. Not fear of harm, but fear of unmaking. What follows is equally telling. Cthulhu is wounded, or perhaps dissipated, when Johansen's ship rams into him. The thing was not dead, Johansen writes, but a kind of temporary defeat. The creature recoalesces and sinks with Rolia once more. This anticlimax is deliberate. Cthulhu's rise is not conquest, but aberration. The world corrects itself by resubmerging the impossible. The brief glimpse destabilizes reality, but does not alter its long-term structure. Consider carefully what this reveals. Even the god's partial awakening cannot be sustained within the narrative. Reality, both within the story and within the medium of fiction itself, rejects Cthulhu's full emergence. The myth depends on his return to sleep. This oscillation between presence and absence defines the story's epistemic logic. The narrator, piecing together his sources, admits, what has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. This statement, echoing the story's famous Necronomicon couplet, collapses the boundary between death and sleep, between knowledge and oblivion. In Lovecraft's world, time does not move forward, it loops. Cthulhu's potential awakening is always imminent, never fulfilled. This eternal imminence becomes a kind of philosophical horror. The reader is trapped in anticipation, and this anticipation becomes the very mechanism of dread. Cthulhu never wakes, not because he lacks power, but because the very fabric of the story, and by extension, the human mind, cannot contain his waking. It is here that the call of Cthulhu achieves its most subtle effect. It transforms the reader into a participant in the myth. By reading Thurston's manuscript, we inherit the same fragments that drove him to despair. His warning, I hope that no one else will have to put together the hints which I have pieced together, doubles as Lovecraft's own sleight of hand. The story is not only a tale about forbidden knowledge, it is forbidden knowledge. To read it is to perform the same act of inquiry, to risk the same epistemic consequences. In this way, the story infects rather than informs. It spreads through cognition, not conviction. Cthulhu does not rise, but the idea of him does. He sleeps in the text as he sleeps in earlier, hidden, waiting, partially revealed through distortion. This recursive structure also speaks to Lovecraft's use of fiction as containment. The myth cannot be fully articulated without collapsing its own premise. The god cannot be fully described without becoming an object, a monster, a trope. Thus, Lovecraft resists exposition at every turn. Cthulhu remains vague in origin, shape, motive. The story provides just enough detail to awaken dread, but not enough to awaken understanding. And this balance sustains the horror. The narrative functions like a ritual. It invokes without conjuring, names without revealing, approaches without touching. This is not a flaw. It is the core mechanic of the mythos. We must recognize the philosophical finality of this narrative logic. Cthulhu never truly wakes, because to do so would render the myth finite. Revelation would replace recursion, and closure would dissolve mystery. Lovecraft's genius lies in encoding the impossibility of resolution into the myth's structure. The god's sleep is a metaphor for the permanence of unknowing. His city rises only to sink again. His name is spoken only to be doubted. His presence is felt only through dreams and echoes. The horror is not that he might rise. It is that he might always be about to. If the call of Cthulhu reveals the cosmic horror of awakening as a metaphysical threat, then The Shadow over Innsmouth, written 1931, published 1936, brings that horror into the realm of biology, inheritance, and personal identity. In this story, Lovecraft no longer asks what would happen if the old ones stirred in the sea, but instead explores what happens when that sleep persists within us. The horror becomes internalized, not just in thought, but in blood. Cthulhu does not appear by name in this tale, but his presence saturates it. The deep ones who worship him, the rites conducted beneath the waves, and the transformation of the protagonist all serve to demonstrate that the god's slumber is not passive, it is incubational. The myth persists not in eruptions of terror, but in dormant contamination, waiting to activate across generations. The story begins in classic Lovecraftian fashion. An unnamed narrator investigates a decaying New England town, ostensibly conducting a historical and genealogical tour. He arrives in Innsmouth, a coastal settlement shunned by its neighbors and rumored to be home to strange inhabitants. The town is physically rotting, crumbling buildings, empty streets, a pervasive smell of brine, and its people are described as possessing unsettling features. Large eyes, rough skin, odd gaits. These are not merely cosmetic abnormalities, they are signs of change, markers of something ancient working its way to the surface. The townspeople are hybrids, offspring of humans and deep ones, an amphibious race that worships Father Dagon, Mother Hydra, and most significantly, Great Cthulhu. The hybridization is not symbolic. It is physical, irreversible, and inevitable. The horror is not in sudden revelation, but in slow inheritance. One of the story's central devices is the Innsmouth look, a constellation of deformities that afflicts the townspeople as they age. Youth may pass for human, but adulthood brings grotesque transformation. The townspeople speak of going into the sea when the change becomes complete. The narrator initially regards this with disgust and fear, interpreting the degeneracy as the result of miscegenation and occultism. But as he continues to investigate, visiting the derelict New England port, evading cultists, and uncovering the town's history, he comes to realize that he himself is not an outsider, but a descendant. He has the blood of the deep ones in him. The narrative ends with a reversal. I shall dwell with them in wonder and glory forever, he writes, having abandoned resistance and embraced his transformation. Cthulhu never rises, but his blood awakens, not in the sky, but in the protagonist's veins. We must pause here, for this reveals something profound. The horror in The Shadow over Innsmouth is not cataclysmic, it is genetic. Lovecraft replaces the cosmic eruption of Erlia with the quiet horror of ancestry. The transformation is not caused by external rupture, but by a sleeper within. The story thus becomes a mirror to the call of Cthulhu, where madness spreads through dreams. Here, it spreads through DNA. Cthulhu's dream is now inherited, passed down silently through generations. And this aligns with Lovecraft's broader cosmology, where time is deep, change is inevitable, and knowledge reveals not power, but helplessness. The myth is not discovered, it is remembered. The narrator's investigation does not uncover a secret, it uncovers a destiny. There is also a narrative strategy at work. Lovecraft structures the story as a confessional, a retrospective account delivered from a liminal space between humanity and monstrosity. The narrator begins in skepticism and ends in acceptance. But this acceptance is not liberation, it is absorption. The final lines, describing his plans to join his kind beneath the sea, do not resolve the horror, they deepen it. The reader, who followed the narrator in fear and revulsion, must now reckon with a perspective that embraces the very thing it once abhorred. The protagonist does not defeat the myth, he becomes part of it. Not X, but Y. It is not the monster that emerges from the sea, but the human that sinks into it. This inversion subverts reader expectations and reinforces the myth's recursive logic. Once infected, one cannot return. The deep ones themselves are not monsters in the conventional sense. They are immortal, technologically advanced, and seemingly indifferent to human morality. Their worship of Cthulhu is not fanaticism, it is recognition. They understand their place within a greater ecological system, one in which humans are a temporary aberration. In this light, Innsmouth is not a town of decay, but of preservation. It maintains rights and bloodlines from before recorded history. The sea, again, is not merely a setting, it is the womb of transformation, the fluid through which the god dreams and evolves his hybrids. Cthulhu's sleep does not halt change, it permits it. The deep ones are midwives of his dream, not heralds of his awakening. What the shadow over Innsmouth accomplishes then is a shift in the locus of horror, from the cosmic to the domestic, from stars to blood. The narrator's discovery is not of a lurking entity, but of a truth embedded in his identity. The story embodies what we might call ontological betrayal, the realization that one is not who or what one believed themselves to be. And this betrayal is not a twist, but an inevitability. The protagonist is drawn not by choice, but by nature. He returns to the sea because he must. Cthulhu's dream requires no coercion, only recognition. We must also consider the political and racial anxieties latent within the story. Lovecraft, writing from a deeply xenophobic perspective, encoded many of his fears into narratives of degeneracy and interbreeding. The horror of tainted blood is clearly present, yet modern readings have often reinterpreted the story as a critique of purity myths themselves. The transformation can be read not as degeneration, but as evolution. The narrator does not collapse. He ascends into a new awareness, a broader ecological belonging. In this view, the horror lies not in the deep one's existence, but in the human insistence on resisting them. Thus, Cthulhu's sleep becomes a metaphor not for repression, but for potentiality. The story's arc is one of awakening, just not the kind that can ever return to human categories of reason. The shadow over Innsmouth reconfigures Cthulhu's myth from an external apocalypse to an internal metamorphosis. The god remains asleep, but his influence ripples outward, not through storms or quakes, but through heredity, memory, and dream. The myth continues not by surfacing, but by submerging deeper. As the narrator gives himself over to his transformation, we are left with the chilling possibility that we, too, carry dormant truths in our blood, waiting, watching, ready to awaken not through destruction, but through identity. The myth of Cthulhu was never solely Lovecraft's. Though he originated the concept and shaped its philosophical core, he intentionally invited others to contribute to his growing corpus of cosmic horror. His letters reveal an open-door attitude toward what would come to be known only after his death as the Cthulhu mythos. Yet this openness created a paradox. The myth depended on incompletion, on sleep, on silence. Collaborative expansion, by its nature, introduces definition, taxonomy, and theology, all things Lovecraft carefully avoided. The tension between these two approaches, Lovecraft's dreamlike ambiguity and his successor's systematizing instinct, defines the strange and uneven evolution of the mythos. As we examine the contributions of August Derleth and others, we must ask, what is lost when a god who must not wake is given purpose, personality, or narrative arc? August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and the man most responsible for preserving and popularizing his work, made some of the earliest and most influential contributions to the mythos posthumously, but Derleth misunderstood, or perhaps deliberately revised, Lovecraft's metaphysical indifference. Where Lovecraft wrote of amoral, incomprehensible entities governed by entropy and scale, Derleth imposed a dualistic framework. He reinterpreted the mythos as a conflict between the elder gods, forces of good, and the great old ones, forces of evil, casting Cthulhu and his ilk as demonic figures opposed by benevolent cosmic guardians. In stories such as The Black Seal and The Lurker at the Threshold, co-written posthumously with Lovecraft's notes, Derleth introduced fire and water symbolism, elemental classifications, and moral consequences. Cthulhu was no longer a dormant presence. He was an enemy of cosmic order. We must recognize how radically this alters the myth's function. In Lovecraft's original vision, Cthulhu does not wake because he cannot wake, not in a narrative sense, but in a philosophical one. His dormancy protects the cognitive fabric of reality. But in Derleth's mythos, Cthulhu doesn't wake because he's being stopped, imprisoned by good gods, awaiting final confrontation. This recasts the myth in eschatological terms. It becomes a war story with battles, heroes, and outcomes, not X, but Y. It is not that awakening is unthinkable, but that it must be prevented. This inversion transforms cosmic horror into cosmic fantasy. The reader is no longer destabilized by the unknown, but reassured by its containment. The unknowable becomes an enemy, and thus knowable. Despite its departure from Lovecraft's spirit, Derleth's model proved remarkably influential. It provided readers and writers with a usable framework, names, categories, hierarchies that allowed the mythos to expand across decades and media. Role-playing games like Call of Cthulhu, 1981, by Chaosium, adopted Derleth's taxonomy, introducing stat blocks for gods, sanity points, and investigative mechanics. This codification extended the myth's reach, but also calcified its mystery. Cthulhu became a boss monster, a statted entity, a figure that could be summoned, defeated, or researched. His sleep became a temporary condition, not a necessary one. The mythos, in becoming playable, became containable. Lovecraft's abyss had been measured, and therefore dulled. Yet not all post-Lovecraftian writers embraced Derleth's revisions. Authors such as Ramsey Campbell, Thomas Ligotti, Caitlin R. Kiernan, and Laird Barron return to Lovecraft's themes of indifference, fragmentation, and psychological erosion. Campbell's The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, expands the mythos into rural England, but retains the idea of entities that distort space and time rather than battle for dominion. Kiernan's Agents of Dreamland, 2017, and her other short fiction often explore the intersection of memory, identity, and cosmic infection, suggesting that the mythos functions best when it remains fluid, personal, and incompletely seen. These writers reject narrative closure, instead embracing ontological drift, a sense that the universe is never fixed, and that horror lies not in confrontation, but in reconfiguration. Thomas Ligotti, perhaps the most philosophically aligned with Lovecraft, explicitly reframes cosmic horror as a mode of anti-narrative. In works like The Lost Feast of Harlequin or The Shadow at the Bottom of the World, Ligotti presents horror as the realization that agency, identity, and time are illusions. His cosmos is not at war. It is asleep, indifferent, and unchanging. Cthulhu is rarely named in his fiction, but the logic of Cthulhu pervades it. Ligotti's own philosophical writing, particularly The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, explicitly credits Lovecraft as a central influence, aligning the mythos with pessimistic philosophy, antinatalism, and the unreliability of consciousness itself. And this reading, Cthulhu's slumber is not passive, but structural. He sleeps because awakening would dissolve the very illusion of human selfhood. More recently, the mythos has been reimagined through lenses of post-colonialism, queer theory, and ecological horror. In Sylvia Moreno Garcia's short fiction and Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, Lovecraftian narratives are retold through perspectives marginalized by Lovecraft's own prejudices. Here, Cthulhu becomes a symbol not of external horror, but of systemic forces, capitalism, racism, environmental collapse, that dream through institutions and geographies. These stories return to Lovecraft's themes of powerlessness and skill, but invert the framing. The horror is not that we are irrelevant to the gods, but that the gods may be indistinguishable from the very structures we live within. Cthulhu does not rise from the sea. He manifests through city planning, surveillance, industrialization. His sleep becomes infrastructural. We must pause here and acknowledge the irony. The more the mythos expands, the more it returns to its origin. Attempts to narrativize Cthulhu through battles, pantheons, or RPG campaigns have largely failed to replicate the original effect of the myth. They awaken the god, only to render him visible, graspable, killable, and in doing so, they neutralize him. But the most effective expansions, the most faithful successes, are those that let him sleep and allow his presence to be felt rather than resolved. These works recognize that Cthulhu is not a character, but a pressure, a weight that distorts thought, perception, and time. So what is the future of a god who must never wake? Perhaps it lies in fragmentation, in whispers across media, games, comics, metafiction, music that evoke without clarifying, in ARGs and creepypasta that resurrect Lovecraft's documentary style, in digital hauntings and transmedia fiction that simulate the very epistemic erosion Lovecraft described. Cthulhu may never wake, but his dream mutates, adapting to new forms. As long as his myth resists resolution, it will endure. The myth of Cthulhu did not remain confined to literature. As with any potent symbol, it escaped its textual origin and seeped into the wider cultural imagination. Though Lovecraft's stories were originally published in niche pulp magazines and circulated among small circles of weird fiction enthusiasts, the image of the sleeping god, tentacled, submerged, waiting, has evolved into a persistent modern archetype. This migration from fiction to folklore has birthed urban legends, hoaxes, and pseudo-real encounters that blur the boundary between narrative and belief. The question, why does Cthulhu never truly wake, takes on a new form here, not as a philosophical inquiry, but as a cultural echo, repeated by those who may never have read Lovecraft, yet feel the pressure of the myth nonetheless. One of the earliest examples of Cthulhu's transformation into pseudo-reality occurred online during the early days of internet forums and bulletin boards. In the 1990s, users began sharing doctored photographs of oceanic anomalies, cyclopean ruins beneath the Pacific, strange sonar blips off the Chilean coast, massive shadows caught by Google Earth off the shore of Ponape. These were often accompanied by quotes attributed to the Necronomicon, passages taken from Lovecraft's stories, or invented whole cloth, always presented with the solemn ambiguity of conspiracy. On sites like Above Top Secret and early Reddit threads, one could find claims that Cthulhu's temple had been located, or that certain ancient cultures had references to Kutu or Cthulhu. The effect was cumulative. Fiction, hoax, and half-remembered fragments combined to suggest a myth with its own kind of folkloric weight. We must recognize the significance of this shift. When a fictional entity begins to generate found evidence, it has passed from narrative into modern myth. It functions less as a literary character and more as an organizing principle for certain kinds of fears. Deep time, the unknowable sea, the fragility of perception. Consider the case of the bloop, a mysterious ultra-low frequency sound recorded by the NOAA in 1997. The agency later attributed it to ice quakes, but for years, it fueled speculation that something massive was stirring beneath the ocean. Lovecraft was never cited in the official data, but Cthulhu was everywhere in the commentary. The event took on symbolic value, not because of its scientific ambiguity, but because it confirmed what some already felt to be true, that something ancient sleeps beneath us and occasionally shifts in its dreaming. Similarly, the rise of ARGs, alternate reality games, and creepypasta brought Cthulhu-style logic into digital folklore. In these environments, stories are not delivered linearly, but discovered through fragments, emails, distorted audio, scrambled web pages, uncanny coordinates. One notable example is the Cicada 3301 mystery, which used cryptic puzzles involving ancient texts, steganography, and esoteric symbols to draw players into an unseen intelligence's orbit. Though never explicitly Lovecraftian, the structure of the game mimicked his narrative technique: suggestion over explanation, layers without closure, knowledge that infects rather than reveals. The game itself became a myth, a test of who could see through the dream of the internet into something older, colder, and watching. This process mirrors the folkloric mechanics of older traditions. In medieval Europe, stories of buried cities, like Wisch in Brittany or Vineta in the Baltic, served as cautionary tales about hubris and divine wrath. These cities were said to rise occasionally from the depths, usually visible for only a moment before vanishing again. The logic is eerily similar to R'lyeh, a place out of time, always submerged, whose brief emergence signals a disruption of natural order. By echoing this form, the Cthulhu myth gains folkloric plausibility. It feels old, even though it is modern. It speaks in the same cadences as older myths, using sleep, sea, and silence as its vocabulary. We must also consider the rise of real cult rumors, whispers that somewhere, in remote jungles or polar outposts, isolated groups practice rites to awaken Cthulhu. These rumors often accompany fabricated documents or videos, grainy footage of stone altars, cryptic chants, flickering footage of towering silhouettes glimpsed at sea. While clearly fictional, these narratives invite a specific kind of belief, not belief in fact, but belief in pattern. They imply that the world contains secrets that resist rational inquiry, that our understanding of history and nature is only partial. In this way, the myth of Cthulhu does not replace religion or science. It haunts the space between them. Why does this persist? Because Cthulhu embodies something we already suspect, that human consciousness is not the measure of reality, and that some truths, should we encounter them, would not bring enlightenment, but collapse. The myth survives not because it is plausible, but because it feels appropriate in an age of climate crisis, ecological unease, and geopolitical entropy. The ocean, rising and acidifying, becomes a literal metaphor for the sleeping god. The deep is no longer just metaphorical, it is empirical and rising. Cthulhu doesn't need to wake. The world is waking into him. It is important to leave this open-ended. Cthulhu, in his folkloric form, resists finality. Urban legends never offer resolution, they offer repetition. The god remains sleeping not because his myth is forgotten, but because it is retold. With each new sighting, each new hoax, the dream pulses again. Whether shared through a blurry TikTok, a satellite glitch, or a whisper about sonar anomalies, the message is the same. Something vast sleeps beneath our comprehension, and we, unknowingly, continue the chant. As the myth of Cthulhu moved from pulp fiction to the broader cultural imagination, it encountered a fundamental challenge. How do you adapt a god who must never fully wake into mediums that rely on visibility, action, and resolution? Film, games, and music all demand sensory engagement and structural closure, yet the essence of Lovecraft's cosmic horror lies in withholding. The horror is not in what is shown, but in what resists depiction, not in what is understood, but in what shatters understanding. This tension has produced a fascinating array of adaptations, homages, and reinterpretations, some faithful to the myth's evasive nature, others converting it into spectacle. Yet across these forms, Cthulhu's dream persists. Even when altered, commodified, or misunderstood, the god remains asleep at the edge of representation, distorting whatever tries to contain him. Film has struggled, and often failed, to fully capture the Lovecraftian mode. Hollywood's narrative structures depend on human protagonists, moral stakes, and climactic confrontations, while Lovecraft's mythos offers none of these comforts. Nonetheless, filmmakers have found indirect ways to channel Cthulhu's essence. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, though not a direct adaptation, is deeply Lovecraftian in its themes of bodily corruption, isolation, and the horror of identity collapse. The shape-shifting alien, discovered in Antarctic ice, echoes the mythic trope of a being not dead, but dreaming beneath the surface. Similarly, The Mist, 2007, based on Stephen King's novella, depicts creatures emerging from a dimensional rift, their incomprehensible forms hidden by fog. One character speculates, "These things, they must have slept in there, waiting for us to wake them." The implication is familiar. It is not evil that rises, but indifference, an ecosystem of beings whose mere presence destroys the human frame of reference. More explicit homages can be found in The Call of Cthulhu, 2005, a low-budget independent film made by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. Remarkably, it was shot as a black-and-white silent movie using 1920s techniques, preserving the story's historical texture and aesthetic distance. Rather than attempt to literalize Cthulhu's appearance with CGI, the film emphasizes atmosphere, suggestion, and the uncanny geometry of Hrolia. By leaning into silence and abstraction, the film avoids the trap of over-revealing the myth's central figure. The god's presence remains suggestive, fragmented, a reflection of the story's original mode. It shows that faithful adaptation is not about recreating the monster, but preserving the logic of dreaming. Video games, paradoxically, have often been more successful in capturing Lovecraftian horror, precisely because they allow for uncertainty, repetition, and psychological erosion. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, 1981, by Chaosium, introduced generations of players to the mythos through mechanics of sanity loss, a system where the more one learns, the more one descends into madness. This inversion of traditional progression systems aligns perfectly with Lovecraft's themes. Unlike typical games where knowledge empowers, Call of Cthulhu teaches players that curiosity leads only to fragmentation. The god never appears directly, but his presence warps the very structure of the game. Players do not defeat him. They survive, at best, with fragments of sanity intact. More recent digital games have built on this model. Bloodborne, 2015, developed by From Software, incorporates Lovecraftian imagery and metaphysics into its core. Initially presented as a gothic horror game, Bloodborne slowly reveals a hidden layer of cosmic horror, ancient gods, dream realities, and insight mechanics that alter perception. As the player accumulates insight, the world itself begins to change. Monsters previously unseen become visible, background elements shift, and NPCs begin to behave differently. The mechanic literalizes the epistemic collapse central to the Cthulhu mythos. Knowledge is not illumination, it is infection. Cthulhu never appears by name, but his essence is everywhere, a slumbering god thing, glimpsed only through rituals, ruins, and madness. Music offers a different form of adaptation, less narrative, more atmospheric. In genres like dark ambient and black metal, Lovecraftian themes have found fertile ground. Bands such as Nile, The Great Old Ones, and Shub-Niggurath draw directly from the mythos, blending guttural soundscapes with references to R'lyeh, Yog-Sothoth, and of course, Cthulhu. These tracks often incorporate drone, dissonance, and non-traditional song structures, evoking a sense of vastness, unease, and slow descent. One can hear the sea in these compositions, the slow pressure of something moving far below. We must recognize that these works do not describe Cthulhu. They resonate with him. They bypass language and narrative, speaking instead in vibration, rhythm, and noise. The myth is not retold. It is felt. Even outside niche genres, Cthulhu has entered the broader cultural soundscape. Metallica's instrumental track, The Call of Cthulhu, 1984, while not lyrical, evokes the dread and grandeur of the myth through its title and ominous composition. Other artists, from noise musicians to cinematic composers, have gestured toward the mythos by invoking deep textures, uncanny harmonies, and cyclical progressions. These auditory forms replicate the myth's recursive structure. Like the story itself, the music loops, builds, and collapses, never resolving, always hinting. What unites these adaptations is their recognition, sometimes deliberate, sometimes intuitive, that Cthulhu cannot be shown without being diminished. The more literal the depiction, the more the god becomes a monster, a creature, a thing. But the best works resist this. They depict instead the approach, the drift into madness, the dream before waking. Cthulhu's persistence in modern media is not due to his form, but due to his function. He represents that which narrative cannot hold, that which image cannot render, that which sound cannot clarify. He survives because he is never fully captured. Yet this persistence is not without cost. As the myth circulates through popular media, it risks dilution. Cthulhu, plush toys, board games, and novelty t-shirts threaten to domesticate what was once unnameable. The god becomes a mascot, a punchline, a meme. But even here, something strange happens. The humor does not fully erase the horror. The image, distorted and commodified, still carries with it a trace of the dream. We laugh at the plush god, but somewhere beneath that laughter, the sea still stirs. Few fictional creations have traveled as fluidly between popular culture, academic discourse, and esoteric subcultures as Cthulhu. Since his debut in 1928, the sleeping god has transcended his pulp origins to become an omnipresent figure in philosophy, art, fandom, and even occult practice. Each domain approaches him differently. Some treat him as metaphor, others as myth, a few as a living symbol. But all are drawn to the same gravitational pull, the sense that beneath the surface of reality, something vast, ancient, and sleeping persists. Cthulhu has become less a monster than a cultural function, a shorthand for the unthinkable. To trace his afterlife across these subcultural and academic appropriations is to study how the 20th and 21st centuries have sought meaning in the very absence of it. The academic reclamation of Lovecraft began cautiously, emerging in the mid-20th century as scholars recognized that his fiction, once dismissed as pulp sensationalism, possessed profound philosophical and aesthetic coherence. Figures such as Michel Houellebecq, in his essay H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 1991, cast Lovecraft as a metaphysician of despair, a writer who stripped away human pretensions and confronted the horror of a godless cosmos. Later, philosophers like Eugene Thacker and Graham Harman situated Lovecraft within speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, uses Lovecraft to explore the idea of the world without us, the unhuman world that exists beyond perception. Cthulhu, in this framework, is not merely fictional, but metaphysical, the name of a reality that withdraws from human comprehension. We must recognize what this reveals. Lovecraft's creation has become philosophy's mirror, reflecting the boundaries of thought itself. Academic discussions of Cthulhu also intersect with cultural studies, where scholars have analyzed the myth's adaptability. The god's name now serves as metaphor for global capitalism, algorithmic systems, and environmental crisis. In this context, the sleeping Cthulhu represents the invisible infrastructures that govern human life, vast, unconscious networks of data, finance, and climate systems. These structures, like the god himself, are omnipresent yet unseen, indifferent to human intention. We cannot confront them directly. We can only sense their influence. Not X, but Y. It is not that Cthulhu will awaken one day, but that he already is, as the world's self-operating machinery. Such readings transform Lovecraft's nightmare into social critique. The horror is no longer cosmic distance, but systemic intimacy, the realization that the inhuman is already inside our systems, our economies, our bodies. Parallel to academic interpretation, Cthulhu has flourished within subcultures that mix irony, devotion, and performance. Within fandom, he occupies a paradoxical position, simultaneously terrifying and endearing. Plush toys, comic parodies, and tongue-in-cheek prayers to our Lord Cthulhu coexist with meticulously researched mythological expansions. This domestication of the god may appear to trivialize him, yet it demonstrates the myth's adaptive resilience. By joking about Cthulhu, audiences acknowledge his presence while neutralizing his threat. Humor functions as containment, a way of keeping the abyss at arm's length. But as many commentators have noted, the joke often circles back on itself. To laugh at Cthulhu is still to speak his name, to participate in his ongoing dream. The meme and the ritual are not opposites, they are modern equivalents. Some subcultures have taken that ritual aspect seriously. Within the loosely organized practices of chaos magic, an occult tradition that emphasizes belief as a tool rather than truth, Cthulhu and the Great Old Ones have been adopted as usable mythic frameworks. Practitioners such as Kenneth Grant and Phil Hine have written of invoking Lovecraftian imagery to explore the boundaries of consciousness. These rituals are not acts of worship in a conventional sense, but experiments in what one might call psychological mythography. The magician does not believe in Cthulhu as literal being. They use his image as a symbolic engine to access states of awe, terror, and dissolution. The boundary between fiction and spirituality dissolves. Lovecraft, a staunch materialist who mocked religion, would likely have recoiled at this development, yet it completes the circle. A fictional god of cosmic indifference becoming a living symbol of subjective transcendence. Academia and subculture meet in the growing field of Lovecraftian scholarship, which treats the mythos as a cultural ecosystem. Conferences, journals, and symposiums examine his influence across disciplines: psychology, theology, digital humanities. Scholars debate whether Lovecraft's cosmicism anticipates existentialist philosophy or nihilistic realism. Others focus on his aesthetics, how his refusal to describe, his reliance on suggestion and negation, anticipates postmodern narrative theory. The god who never wakes becomes a metaphor for the text that never closes. Cthulhu's dream is reinterpreted as the academic enterprise itself, perpetual inquiry without final revelation. In studying him, scholars mirror his myth, forever approaching, never arriving. Beyond the academy, Cthulhu thrives in art and performance. Visual artists from H.R. Giger to Zdzisław Beksiński have drawn on Lovecraftian imagery, biomechanical deities, organic geometries, decaying dreamscapes. Contemporary installations and digital artists reinterpret relief as data architecture, depicting the internet itself as a sleeping god's nervous system. Musicians and performance artists incorporate Lovecraftian motifs into sound and ritual, transforming concerts into immersive invocations. The appeal lies not in horror, but in scale. The myth allows creators to explore the sublime, the sense of standing before something vast, ancient, and uncontainable. Cthulhu thus becomes a shared language for the modern experience of the infinite, whether technological, psychological, or spiritual. We must pause here to reflect on the irony. Lovecraft's fiction, which sought to express meaninglessness, has become a source of meaning for countless readers, artists, and thinkers. His indifferent universe has generated endless fascination, devotion, and even reverence. This paradox lies at the heart of the myth's endurance. Cthulhu never wakes precisely because he must remain a site of projection, a blank magnitude onto which each generation casts its fears and desires. The god's sleep is not a failure of narrative, but the condition of its renewal. Every academic paper, every art installation, every ironic t-shirt is another dream, another layer of the same ancient story. At the final threshold of Lovecraft's mythology, where the literary, cultural, and subcultural give way to the interior, we find the most disturbing truth of all. Cthulhu persists not simply because of his narrative or symbolic function, but because he speaks to something already present in the human psyche. His dream is our dread, his sleep is our silence, and his refusal to rise, despite omnipresent hints and cultic anticipation, mirrors a deeper existential paradox, that what we fear most is not destruction, but revelation. In this final analysis, Cthulhu endures because he expresses a question the modern mind cannot unask. What happens when we realize we were never meant to understand? The figure of the sleeping god is not new. Mythologies throughout history have included deities in states of rest, Brahma dreaming the universe, Cronus imprisoned beneath the earth, the hidden imam in Shia eschatology, awaiting return. But Lovecraft's Cthulhu reverses their narrative functions. Those gods sleep to return. Cthulhu sleeps because return is impossible or inadvisable. His dormancy is not anticipation, it is insulation. It keeps us from seeing what lies beyond the veil of meaning. Consider carefully what this suggests. Cthulhu's awakening would not simply mark the end of civilization, but the end of thought as we know it. Not apocalypse, but apophysis, the erasure of all concepts. Psychologically, this maps onto the modern condition with disturbing fidelity. As human knowledge expands into quantum mechanics, artificial intelligence, climate collapse, and deep time, we encounter the same boundary again and again. Comprehension fades as scale increases. Cthulhu becomes the symbol for that tipping point, the moment when the known world buckles under the weight of its own implications. Eugene Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, calls this the world without us, a domain not hostile to humanity, but simply indifferent. Lovecraft understood this intuitively. The terror is not that the universe hates us, it's that it doesn't notice us at all. Cthulhu dreams not of conquest, but of nothing. And in that nothing, we see the reflection of our most secret fear, that everything we do may ultimately dissolve into the abyss. This realization has particular resonance in a world shaped by existential anxiety. The 21st century is defined by slow crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, systemic collapse, that unfold at scales larger than any one human lifetime. These processes resemble Cthulhu's dream, invisible, inevitable, and catastrophic when glimpsed directly. Psychological studies show that individuals confronted with unsolvable or unthinkable problems often enter states of denial, paralysis, or what Timothy Morton has called hyperobjects, entities so vast in space and time that they defy perception. Cthulhu, in this model, is the ultimate hyperobject. His shape, presence, and motives cannot be parsed. He is not a threat to be avoided, but a condition to be endured. And yet, paradoxically, we want to see him. Popular culture is filled with renditions of Cthulhu, rising from the sea, towering over cities, demolishing symbols of human pride. These images are cathartic. They offer finality, spectacle, a point of narrative conclusion. But the original myth denies that satisfaction. In Lovecraft's stories, the horror always subsides back into dream. Religia rises and sinks. The gods stir and sleep. The knowledge uncovered is lost again. This narrative recoil is not a flaw. It is the mechanism of lasting unease. Cthulhu never truly wakes because his sleep is what sustains the horror. To show him fully, to explain him, is to diminish him. Horror, like dreams, requires incompletion to survive. This points to a profound philosophical function. Cthulhu embodies the void at the center of meaning, the recognition that language, reason, and perception are human constructs floating on a sea of uncertainty. His dream is the background hum beneath reality, the suppressed knowledge that all order is temporary. In this sense, he is not merely a figure of fiction, but a dramatization of epistemological humility. We do not know. We cannot know. And to try to know fully is to risk the collapse of the self. This is why madness accompanies insight in Lovecraft's work, not because the mind is weak, but because the structure of reality resists the mind's categories. It's not that the truth is horrifying, it's that truth, in its totality, undoes the knower. This is why Cthulhu has become a symbol across disciplines, not for fear, but for limit. In philosophy, he marks the boundary where metaphysics fails. In psychology, he signals the moment when perception collapses into overwhelm. In ecology, he represents nature's scale and complexity beyond human stewardship. In theology, he replaces the personal God with an impersonal abyss. He is the answer to a question we didn't mean to ask. What if there is no meaning, only magnitude? And yet, perhaps there is strange comfort in this. Cthulhu's dream implies a kind of stability, an order outside human order, a duration beyond human time. The stars will align and unalign, with or without us. His worshippers may chant in hidden groves, but they do not hasten his waking. The myth assures us that we are not central, but neither are we targets. We are incidental to the dream, and that, in itself, may be a form of peace. The burden of purpose, of finality, is lifted. The god sleeps. The sea rises. We continue, uncertain, dreaming, haunted. We must end not with answers, but with echoes. Cthulhu never truly wakes because he cannot, not within narrative, not within language, not within human cognition. His slumber is not a delay, but a law. He is the name we give to that which sleeps beneath every explanation, every philosophy, every system. And the more we circle him, the more we retell his myth, sketch his image, dream his name, the more his sleep deepens. He does not rise because the story does not end. And perhaps that is the final horror, or the final mercy, or both. The dream continues,